Number 1. The Bog Bodies. In the spring of 1950, a peat cutter named Viggo Højgaard was working a bog outside the village of Tollund in central Denmark when his shovel struck something unexpected. Not stone, not root, something soft. He dug carefully. He found a face, a human face, staring upward through the dark peat, calm as a man sleeping. The skin was leathery, but unbroken. The features were precise: high cheekbones, closed eyelids, a stubbled chin. A braided leather rope was knotted tightly around the neck. The police came immediately, assuming they had a recent murder. Then the radiocarbon results arrived. That face had been looking up through the darkness for 2,400 years. He became known as Tollund Man. And to this day, nobody knows who decided he had to die. Tollund Man is the most famous, but he is far from the most disturbing. In 1952, workers in Nebelgard Bog in Denmark unearthed Tollund Man, a body so well preserved that forensic scientists could lift his fingerprints. His throat had been cut from ear to ear in a single, deliberate stroke. In 1984, peat workers in Cheshire, England, found Tollund Man. He had been hit across the skull with a blunt object, strangled with a cord, and had his throat cut. 3 separate acts of killing, performed in sequence. These were not executions. They were not punishments. The bogs of northern Europe were sacred ground, the membrane between the living world and whatever lay beneath it. These people were placed there as offerings, and the bog kept them perfectly for us to find. The bog bodies span 1,200 years, from roughly 800 BC to 400 AD, the long, largely unwritten stretch of the European Iron Age. They surface across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, and Britain, left by Celts, Germanic tribes, and the ancestors of the Vikings. These cultures kept no texts, no scripture, no court records, no names. All that remains are the bodies themselves. And the bodies are specific. Many victims were young, physically healthy, and well-nourished. Chosen, not seized. Tollund Man's stomach contained a carefully prepared porridge made from 60 distinct plant species, a last meal that took planning, suggesting his death was arranged long in advance. In 2002, researchers analyzing hair samples from Tollund Man found concentrated deposits of mistletoe pollen embedded in the strands. Mistletoe was not an ordinary plant to the Druids. It was harvested with golden sickles at specific lunar phases, used in their highest ceremonies. Its presence on Tollund Man suggests he was anointed before death, prepared, consecrated. Across multiple bodies, scientists identified what scholars now call the triple death: simultaneous strangulation, throat cutting, and blunt head trauma. Celtic cosmology divided existence into 3 realms: earth, sky, and water. A victim killed 3 ways died into all 3 at once. The bog, where land and water blurred, was where all 3 realms converged. The violence was not cruelty. It was architecture. The people who organized these killings held tremendous authority. Priests, ritual leaders, the keepers of a cosmology that the rest of the community depended on for meaning. They determined which seasons would bring harvest and which would bring famine. They interpreted the will of gods nobody could see, and periodically, they announced that the gods required a life. What's striking is how willingly some victims seem to have gone. The absence of defensive wounds on many of the bodies suggests they did not fight, which means they believed, too. The system worked because everyone inside it accepted its logic. These stories are absent from most school curricula. The bog bodies sit in temperature-controlled museum cases in Copenhagen and London and Dublin, meticulously preserved and almost completely ignored by the popular telling of ancient history. It is easier to imagine our ancestors as primitive but peaceful, moving towards civilization in a straight line. The bog bodies complicate that. They show a people with art, agriculture, trade, and ritual murder, all operating simultaneously. Discomfort, it turns out, is its own kind of burial. Scientists can now tell you what Tollund Man ate for breakfast on the last morning of his life: barley, linseed, and a handful of wild seeds, consumed roughly 12 to 24 hours before death. They can map the calluses on his hands, the parasites in his gut, the expression frozen on his face. What they cannot tell you is what he thought in those final hours. Whether he was afraid, whether he chose it. The bog preserved the body perfectly. Everything else is silence. The bog bodies were surrendered to the earth, killed and given away. But not every ancient culture disposed of their dead. Some kept them. There's a city older than Stonehenge where the dead did not leave, where skulls were removed from bodies, decorated, and displayed, where the living and the dead shared the same walls. Number 2, the skull cult. Imagine a city of 10,000 people where there are no streets, no roads, no alleys, no paths between buildings. The houses are packed so tightly together that the only way in is from above. You climb a wooden ladder to the roof, drop through a hole in the ceiling, and descend into your home. That was daily life in Çatalhöyük, a settlement in what is now central Turkey, 9,000 years ago, one of the oldest cities ever found on Earth. But the architecture is not the strange part. The strange part is what was under the floors. The people of Çatalhöyük buried their dead directly beneath their homes, under the sleeping platforms, under the hearths where they cooked their food. And then, after the bodies had decomposed, they dug them back up. They removed the skulls. They coated them in clay, painted them in ochre and red, fitted them with shells for eyes, and brought them back inside. Some of those skulls were passed down through multiple generations. The dead were not gone. They were permanent residents, and they were always watching. Çatalhöyük was no small outpost. Between 7,500 and 5,700 BC, it housed somewhere between 8 and 10,000 inhabitants, a dense, rooftop city where families lived in mud brick homes stacked against one another with no gaps between them. The sleeping areas, the cooking areas, the storage areas, all of it built directly above the buried dead. Archaeologists excavating the site found human remains under nearly every floor. After decomposition, skulls were retrieved, replastered, sometimes repainted, and repositioned. Some were placed on shelves carved into the walls. Others were tucked into niches. A few were buried again beneath the same floors, layered on top of older burials, generation pressed against generation. This was not a fringe practice. This was the culture. Every family in that city lived this way, with the skulls of the people who came before them integrated into the fabric of domestic life. In 2010, excavators working a specific structure in Çatalhöyük's eastern mound made a discovery that changed how researchers understood the entire site. The building contained 67 human skulls. They had been carefully defleshed, painted with geometric patterns, and in several cases drilled through, fitted with cords so they could be hung or carried. The collection included men, women, and children. This was not a family home. It was something else entirely. A place of concentrated, curated death. Some of the skulls showed no genetic relationship to the community around them, suggesting they had been brought from elsewhere, acquired, not inherited. The skull was not merely a memorial. It was a trophy, an object of power, and whoever controlled that building controlled something the rest of the city wanted access to. The families who accumulated the most skulls were not ordinary households. They were the first iteration of something that would repeat throughout human history, a class of people who used sacred objects to legitimize authority. The ancestors, through their skulls, became a bridge between the living and whatever forces governed the world. To hold a skull was to hold that connection. To display it was to announce it. For nearly 2,000 years, this system sustained an entire civilization. Then, around 5,700 BC, Çatalhöyük was abandoned. The houses were left. The skulls were left. Whatever held the city together simply stopped working. Nobody knows why. The site was first identified in 1958 by British archaeologist James Mellart, but large-scale excavation did not begin until the 1990s. For decades, the skulls were categorized as curiosities, evidence of primitive superstition, a people not yet fully separated from death's grip. That framing served a purpose. If the skull cult is primitive, it belongs to a stage humanity has passed through. If it is political, if it is the origin of power itself, then it is something closer and more uncomfortable. The skulls were moved to storage. The murals and figurines got the museum displays. The thing that makes Çatalhöyük genuinely strange was quietly set aside. Today, Çatalhöyük is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tour groups walk through reconstructed rooms and examine replica hearths. The information boards discuss agriculture, community structure, and early urban planning. The 67 skulls from the shrine building are not on display. They are in controlled storage, waiting for further analysis. Excavations are still ongoing. New rooms are still being opened. New floors are still being lifted. And underneath those floors, in a city that has been dead for 7,000 years, there are almost certainly more skulls. Still there, still arranged, still waiting for someone to dig them up again. Çatalhöyük tells us what our ancestors did with the people they lost. But item 3 tells us something about what they wanted from the living, and it reaches further back than any city, any ritual, any written word. A small carved figurine, found in a German cave, holds a secret about human desire that nobody expected to find 40,000 years underground. Number 3. Mass sacrifice. In September 2008, a team of archaeologists excavating the Hohle Fels cave in the Swabian Jura region of southwestern Germany pulled 6 small fragments from the sediment. When fitted together, they formed a figurine roughly 6 centimeters tall, carved from a single piece of mammoth ivory. It depicted a woman. She had no face. Where the head should be was a polished ring, as though designed to be threaded on a cord and worn around the neck. Her arms were thin, almost vestigial. Her legs tapered to a point, but her breasts, hips, stomach, and genitals were carved with pronounced, deliberate exaggeration. Every feature of the female body associated with reproduction enlarged and emphasized. The Venus of Hohle Fels is 40,000 years old. She is the oldest known depiction of a human being ever found on Earth. And the first thing most people feel when they see her is discomfort. She does not match any standard of beauty recognizable to us. She is strange. She is explicit. She is alien. And someone made her with enormous care, carried her across the Ice Age landscape, and kept her for reasons we are only beginning to understand. The Hohle Fels cave was used as a shelter by early Homo sapiens during the Upper Paleolithic, a period when modern humans were spreading across Europe, sharing the continent with the last Neanderthals, and surviving a climate that regularly dropped to temperatures incompatible with unprotected life. The figurine was found near a flint scraping tool, a bone needle, and fragments of other worked ivory. A craftsman's assemblage, not a rubbish heap. The carving itself is technically sophisticated. The proportions are intentional. Whoever made this understood the human body and made specific choices about which parts to enlarge. The ring at the top confirms it was worn, passed between hands, pressed against skin, kept close. This was not decorative. It was carried the way people carry things that matter. Researchers have proposed 3 broad explanations, and each one is more unsettling than the last. The first is that the Venus is a fertility goddess, a ritual object used to invoke abundance, pregnancy, and survival. The second is that she is a self-portrait, a woman carving her own body from her own viewpoint, looking down at herself, reproducing what she actually saw. The third theory requires no mythology at all. In a world where the next meal was not guaranteed, where winter could last 8 months, where carrying excess body fat was the difference between surviving a famine and dying in one, a body like the Venus was the most desirable body imaginable. She was not grotesque to her makers. She was the ideal. Beauty, it turns out, is not a fixed thing. It is a survival strategy wearing a different mask in every era. The they who valued this object were not primitive people fumbling towards civilization. They were anatomically modern humans, the same species, the same brain, the same cognitive capacity as us. They painted the cave walls of Lascaux and Altamira with breathtaking accuracy. They made music, buried their dead with flowers, and navigated hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain. Their values were simply calibrated to a different set of pressures. Scarcity shaped desire. Survival shaped beauty. The Ice Age did not produce lesser humans. It produced different ones. And that difference holds a mirror up to everything we assume is natural about ourselves. The Venus of Hohle Fels is not a secret, exactly. She is published in major journals, housed in a legitimate museum, discussed in academic circles. What she is not is comfortable dinner table conversation. She destabilizes the assumption that human values are stable, that beauty is biological, that desire is hardwired, that what we find attractive is what humans have always found attractive. If the Venus proves that our deepest aesthetic instincts are products of environment rather than nature, then the values we hold right now are equally contingent, equally temporary. That idea is difficult to sit with, so mostly we don't. Today, the Venus of Hohle Fels is displayed at the Erdgeschichtliches Museum in Tübingen, Germany. She is 40,000 years old and faceless, and she poses a question that has no comfortable answer. What will our descendants excavate from our ruins, and what will it tell them about us? What object will they hold up and find grotesque? What desires will they find alien? We look at the Venus and feel the distance between ourselves and our ancestors. But the distance works both ways. In 40,000 years, something we made, something we valued, something we carried close will be the thing that makes them uncomfortable. The mystery is not the Venus. The mystery is what we haven't figured out about ourselves yet. The Venus is 40,000 years old and made of ivory. Item 4 is far more recent and far less quiet. These dead did not stay still. They screamed. Number 4. Cannibal Cave. In the city of Guanajuato in central Mexico, there is a museum that does not display paintings or sculptures or ancient coins. It displays people. Real people, dead for over a century, hanging on walls and standing in cases behind glass. Their skin dried to leather, their clothes still on their bodies, their mouths, many of their mouths, frozen wide open. El Museo de las Momias was not built as a horror attraction. It began as a storage problem. Throughout the 19th century, the municipal cemetery of Guanajuato charged families an annual fee to maintain their loved ones' burial plots. When families fell behind on payments, the cemetery exhumed the bodies to free up space. Workers expected to find bones. Instead, they found something that stopped them cold. The bodies had not decomposed. The soil of Guanajuato, arid, dense with nitrates and minerals, had preserved them intact. Skin, hair, fingernails, facial expressions. The workers began setting the bodies aside. Someone realized people would pay to see them, and so the dead went on display. They have been on display ever since. The oldest of the Guanajuato mummies date to the cholera epidemic of 1833, one of the most devastating disease outbreaks in Mexican history. Cholera moved fast. A person could be healthy at dawn and dead by nightfall, or so it appeared. The victims were overwhelmingly poor, buried in the public cemetery with minimal ceremony, their plots maintained by families who could barely afford the fees in the first place. The soil did the rest. Today, the museum holds over 100 naturally mummified bodies. Some are adults. Some are elderly. Several are children. There is an infant, the smallest natural mummy ever recorded, still in the clothing it was buried in. These were not people selected for preservation. They were people who could not afford to stay in the ground. The screaming faces are the detail that stays with visitors long after they leave. For years, the explanation offered was simple. Jaw muscles relax after death. Mouths fall open. The mummification process fixes them there. But forensic researchers examining the Guanajuato mummies have found evidence that complicates that story. Some bodies show arms raised and bent at the elbow, as though bracing against a surface above them. Some show fingers worn at the tips. Some have the specific facial contortion, brow contracted, mouth fully open, head tilted back, that is consistent not with peaceful death but with oxygen deprivation. In the 19th century, cholera victims frequently fell into deep comas that mimicked death closely enough to fool the physicians of the era. Premature burial was not a Gothic fiction. It was documented. It happened often enough that German inventor Johann Taberger designed a coffin bell system in 1829, a string tied to the corpse's hand, running up through the earth to a bell above ground, specifically to alert cemetery workers if someone woke up underground. So the people in that museum may have woken up, and no one heard them. The question of who bears responsibility for that horror does not have a clean answer. The families acted on the best medical information available. The doctors worked without the diagnostic tools that would have made the difference. The cemetery authorities enforced fees that were standard practice across the region. The system, taken as a whole, produced an outcome in which poor people were buried before they were dead, and then, when their families could no longer pay, exhumed and put on public display. No individual villain, just a society that consistently valued the comfort of the living over the dignity of the poor, and found ways to profit from both. The museum generates significant tourism revenue for Guanajuato. It has been featured in travel guides, horror documentaries, and lists of the world's most disturbing destinations. Visitors photograph themselves beside the cases. The mummies have appeared in merchandise, figurines, postcards, keychains. There have been calls from human rights advocates and indigenous dignity groups to have the bodies reburied, to remove them from display and return them to the earth. Those calls have not been successful. The argument against reburial is always the same. They are cultural heritage, they are historically significant, they draw visitors, they fund the city. The dead have no legal standing to object. They have no representatives. They have only whatever sound their open mouths are making, frozen there since the 19th century, that we choose to interpret as a scream or choose to interpret as nothing, depending on how much we want to be comfortable. Walk through the museum today, and the mummies look back at you, or would if so many of them had not lost their eyes. They are Guanajuato's most famous residents. The city's official tourism materials describe the experience as unforgettable. They are not wrong. The question the mummies leave you with is not about them. They are pass-carrying. The question is about the living people filing through the room, taking photographs, buying tickets, treating agony as an attraction. The mummies are a mirror, and the reflection is not flattering. The mummies of Guanajuato were taken by disease, by poverty, by a system that failed them. Item 5 is different. Those children did not die because the system failed. They died because the system worked exactly as intended. Number 5, Withering Curse. On the northeastern coast of Tunisia, a few kilometers from the center of modern Tunis, there's a walled enclosure that archaeologists call the Tophet of Carthage. From the outside, it looks unremarkable. A patch of excavated ground, low stone walls, the remnants of an ancient city that Rome destroyed so completely in 146 BC that historians debated for centuries whether it had ever truly existed. But inside the Tophet, stacked in layers going down several meters into the earth, are thousands of terracotta urns. And inside the urns are the cremated bones of children, infants, toddlers, children old enough to walk, old enough to speak, old enough to understand that something was happening to them. The Carthaginians, one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations the ancient Mediterranean ever produced, a seafaring empire that challenged Rome for dominance of the known world, burned their children alive as offerings to their gods. Greek and Roman writers documented it in detail. For generations, modern scholars dismissed those accounts as enemy propaganda, the slander of rival civilizations trying to dehumanize Carthage. Then excavators started opening the urns, and the bones told a different story. Carthage was founded around 814 BC by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now Lebanon. It grew into a commercial and military powerhouse, controlling trade routes across the Western Mediterranean and fielding armies that came within a generation of conquering Rome entirely. The Carthaginians were literate, artistic, and architecturally sophisticated. They built harbors, temples, and a government complex that Greek observers described with genuine admiration. At the center of their religious life were two gods, Baal-Hamon, lord of the sky and fertility, and Tanit, the primary goddess of Carthage, whose symbol, a triangle topped by a horizontal bar and a circle, appeared on monuments and grave markers throughout the city. Both gods, according to ancient accounts, required the most precious possible offering, and the most precious thing a family could give was a child. In the 1970s, a major excavation of the Tophet produced a count that silenced remaining skeptics. More than 20,000 urns, deposited over roughly 6 centuries of Carthaginian history. Physical anthropologists analyzing the bone fragments found remains from children ranging in age from newborn to approximately 4 years old. The critical finding was in the fracture patterns. Living bone and dead bone respond to heat differently. Dead bone, already brittle, tend to crack along existing fault lines. Living bone, still flexible and hydrated, fractures in a specific way when exposed to extreme heat, what forensic scientists call hot bone fractures, distinctive breaks that occur only when the bone is still vital at the moment of burning. The Tophet urns contained hot bone fractures. The children were alive when they entered the fire. The pain was not incidental. Ancient sources suggest it was required. The gods of Carthage did not want a painless death. They wanted the full offering. The families who brought their children to the Tophet were not the desperate poor. Analysis of the grave goods buried with the urns, gold amulets, carved ivory figurines, fine ceramic vessels, indicates that child sacrifice at Carthage was primarily practiced by the wealthy and the powerful. The priests who officiated were among the most influential people in the city. The rulers of Carthage participated. This was not a practice imposed on the powerless by elites who exempted themselves. The elites were the primary practitioners. They believed, with complete sincerity, that they were doing something righteous, that the suffering of one child would secure the favor of the gods for the city, for the harvest, for the fleet about to sail into enemy waters. They were not monsters by their own understanding. They were the most devout people in their civilization, making the hardest possible sacrifice to protect everyone else. That is what makes it so difficult to look at directly. For most of the 20th century, the scholarly consensus held that the Greek and Roman accounts of Carthaginian child sacrifice were exaggerated or fabricated, propaganda designed to justify Rome's eventual annihilation of the city. Carthage was, after all, destroyed so thoroughly that almost no Carthaginian texts survive. The victors wrote the history. It was reasonable to be skeptical, but the bones do not have a political agenda. The hot bone fractures do not care about Roman propaganda. The 20,000 urns, stacked in layers representing 6 centuries of continuous practice, represent a volume of physical evidence that cannot be argued away by appeal to ancient bias. The suppression here was not malicious. It was the ordinary human reluctance to believe that a civilization we admire could also be doing something we find inexcusable. Carthage built beautiful ships and traded in purple dye and lost sons to Rome's legions and burned children in the Tophet, all at the same time. Civilizations contain multitudes. That is the part we find hardest to hold. Today, the Tophet is a designated UNESCO World Heritage Site, part of the broader archaeological zone of ancient Carthage that draws tens of thousands of visitors each year. The urns are distributed between the Bardo National Museum in Tunis and several European collections. Forensic study continues. Researchers are now examining whether the practice intensified during periods of military crisis, whether Carthage burned more children when Rome pressed hardest, as though turning up the volume on the offering when the stakes were highest. The question that the Tophet leaves open is not a historical one. It is this: the impulse to sacrifice the vulnerable for the benefit of the powerful, to frame that sacrifice as noble and necessary and divinely sanctioned. That impulse did not die with Carthage. It simply found new language. The children of the Tophet are gone. The logic that put them there is still very much in use. Carthage gave its children to fire and called it faith. Item 6 is about a different kind of loss. Not a choice, but a catastrophe. A whole world swallowed by rising water, leaving behind nothing but footprints in the mud. Number 6. Demon Tablet. Off the northern coast of British Columbia, in a remote archipelago called Guayhanas, there is a small island named Kilgi Guay. It is difficult to reach. The waters around it are cold and unpredictable, and most of the year the island is visited only by seabirds and the occasional research vessel. But in 2020, archaeologists wading through its tidal flats at low water found something pressed into a layer of ancient mud at the shoreline. Footprints. Human footprints, preserved for 14,000 years beneath the sediment. A set belonging to an adult female, her stride suggesting she was carrying weight. A set belonging to an adult male, walking alongside her. And between them, the small, light impressions of child. A family, moving together along a beach that no longer exists, in a world that has been underwater for more than 10 millennia. They were going somewhere. We do not know where. We do not know their names. We do not know what they said to each other as they walked. All we have is the shape of their feet in the mud, and the fact that the sea came for their world not long after and covered everything they had ever known. Çatalhöyük sits within the traditional territory of the Haida people, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cultures on the northwest coast of North America. 14,000 years ago, at the tail end of the last ice age, the geography of this coastline was almost unrecognizable compared to what exists today. Sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are now. The continental shelf, today submerged beneath the Pacific, was exposed as a broad coastal plain, threaded with rivers, forested in places, open grassland in others, rich with game and shellfish and fresh water. People lived across that entire landscape. They built their lives there, generation after generation, for thousands of years. Then the Pleistocene glaciers began their long retreat. The meltwater had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. The sea rose, slowly at first, then faster, swallowing the coastal plain meter by meter, century by century, until the forests and rivers and beaches where those families had lived were buried under hundreds of feet of cold Pacific water. The islands of Çatalhöyük are the mountain peaks of that drowned world, the only parts that stayed above the surface. The people who lived on the plain retreated upward as the water rose and became the ancestors of the Haida. Their original homeland is gone. What remains of it lies on the ocean floor. The Çatalhöyük footprints are the oldest confirmed human footprints ever found in North America. The mud layer that preserved them was deposited during a period of low tide and then rapidly sealed by rising sea levels, which created the anaerobic, pressurized conditions that kept the impressions intact across 14,000 years of geological change. The prints are extraordinarily detailed. Researchers could determine foot size, gait pattern, and weight distribution with enough precision to identify the likely sex and approximate age of each individual. The woman's prints show a slight forward lean consistent with carrying a load, possibly a child, possibly supplies. The family was moving with purpose, not wandering. They knew this beach. They had been here before. The footprints are not the traces of people lost or frightened. They're the traces of people going about the ordinary business of their lives, on an ordinary day, in a world they had no reason to believe would not last forever. The ancestors who made these footprints watched the sea take their land. Not in a single catastrophic event, no tsunami, no storm surge, but in the slow, relentless accumulation of centimeters per decade, a rise so gradual that a single human life might barely register it, but so consistent that across generations it reshaped everything. Oral histories of the Haida and other Northwest Coast peoples contain accounts of a time when the land extended far beyond its current boundaries, when islands were connected by plains, when the ancestors lived in places now beneath the water. For generations, archaeologists treated these stories as mythology. The footprints at Çatalhöyük confirm they were memory. The people who told those stories were describing something real, a world their ancestors had actually inhabited and actually lost. The drowned landscapes of the post-glacial period are among the least explored archaeological territories on Earth, for the obvious reason that they are underwater. Çatalhöyük was found by chance, exposed by an unusually low tide during a survey that was focused on something else entirely. Systematic underwater archaeology along the submerged continental shelves of North America, Europe, and Asia is still in its earliest stages. What exists down there is genuinely unknown. Entire settlement landscapes, tool caches, burial sites, the physical record of tens of thousands of years of human life along coastlines that are now ocean floor. None of it has been examined. The sea suppressed that history not through malice, but through simple physics. The evidence sank. We're only beginning to develop the tools and the will to go looking for it. The Haida Nation has designated the Çatalhöyük footprints as a protected cultural site. They are not open to the public. They are not in a museum. They're still there in the tidal flat, covered again by water much of the time, exposed only briefly when conditions align. The Haida describe them as a direct connection to their ancestors, proof of presence, proof of continuity, proof that the people who lived on that drowned plain were real and are remembered. But the footprints carry a second meaning that requires no cultural context to feel. The sea rose before, is rising again. The family walking that beach 14,000 years ago had no way of knowing their world was ending. They were just walking. The question the footprints ask, pressing up through 14 millennia of mud, is whether we know something they did not, and whether knowing makes any difference. The family at Çatalhöyük walked into the future and disappeared. Item 7 brings us something darker. A family that did not disappear, but left behind evidence of what hunger and desperation can make human beings do to one another. These are not strangers. These are our cousins. And the bones show what happened. Number 7. Vampire burial. In a limestone cave in the Ardèche region of southern France, called Momias, archaeologists excavating in the 1990s uncovered a collection of bones that took years to fully interpret. The remains belonged to 6 individuals, 2 adults, 2 adolescents, and 2 children. They had lived approximately 120,000 years ago. They were Neanderthals, and they had not been buried or mourned or left undisturbed. They had been butchered. Their bones carried the same cut marks found on deer and horse remains in the same cave layer. Precise incisions from flint tools at the joints where muscle and tendon attach, exactly where a skilled hand would cut to separate a carcass for consumption. The long bones have been cracked longitudinally, the way you crack a bone to extract the marrow inside. The skulls have been opened. The brains have been removed. The bodies have been processed with the same efficiency and the same technique as every other animal in the cave. Whatever they were to each other in life, family, rivals, members of the same group, in death they became food. And the most unsettling part of what Momias revealed was not that it happened once. It was that the evidence keeps appearing across Europe, in cave after cave, suggesting this was not a crisis response. It was a pattern. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia for roughly 350,000 years before disappearing around 40,000 years ago, shortly after modern humans arrived in significant numbers. In that span of time, they developed sophisticated stone tool traditions, controlled fire, constructed shelters, buried at least some of their dead with apparent intentionality, and cared for injured members of their groups, individuals with healed fractures and degenerative conditions who could not have survived without sustained support from others. They were cognitively complex. They were socially organized. They were, in any meaningful sense of the word, human. The Momias assemblage included the remains of those 6 individuals scattered among the remains of red deer, ibex, and other game. The processing marks are identical. The treatment of the human remains was not distinguishable in technique from the treatment of the animal remains. The Neanderthals who ate them did not appear to make a categorical distinction between hunting an animal and consuming a member of their own species. The question of why forces a choice between explanations, each of which is disturbing in a different way. The cave at Momias contained abundant animal bones. The group was not starving. Deer, horses, and large mammals were being hunted successfully at the same time the human remains were being processed. Starvation cannibalism, the version we find easiest to excuse, does not fit the evidence. Some researchers argue for ritual consumption, the idea, documented in various human cultures, that eating a defeated enemy or a respected dead member of your own group transfers their strength, their courage, or their essence to the consumer. Others argue for something simpler and harder to face, that Neanderthal groups competed violently for territory and resources, and that consuming rivals was an extension of that competition, a way of eliminating enemies completely and extracting maximum nutritional value from the act of killing them. The evidence does not resolve the question. The cut marks are identical regardless of motivation. The bones cannot tell us what the people holding the tools were thinking. Neanderthals share approximately 99.7% of their DNA with modern humans. They are not a separate species in any meaningful genetic sense. They are a variant of the human lineage, close enough that interbreeding with early Homo sapiens occurred repeatedly, and close enough that most people alive today carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. The cannibals of Mulagursi are not alien creatures from a divergent evolutionary branch. They are family, and the behavior documented in their bones is not limited to them. Archaeological evidence of cannibalism among early Homo sapiens is equally extensive. At sites across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, human remains show the same processing marks, the same marrow extraction, the same skull opening. The impulse did not belong exclusively to our Neanderthal cousins. It belonged to the broader human family, and it appears consistently enough across enough sites and enough time periods to suggest it was never as rare or as aberrant as we would prefer to believe. The reason Neanderthal cannibalism does not feature prominently in popular accounts of prehistory is not lack of evidence. The evidence has been accumulating for decades. It is that the image of the Neanderthal has gone through a rehabilitation in recent years, from brutish evolutionary dead end to complex, feeling, almost human being deserving of sympathy. That rehabilitation is largely accurate and overdue. But it created a new problem. A sympathetic Neanderthal cannot also be a cannibal, or so the popular narrative seems to feel. The two things cannot both be true simultaneously, even though the bones confirm they were. The suppression here is the suppression of complexity, the insistence that a species must be either noble or monstrous, when the evidence suggests it was, like us, entirely capable of being both at once. The Mulagursi bones are held at the Natural History Museum in Paris, studied periodically as new analytical techniques become available. Each new study adds resolution to the same picture, deliberate, skilled, repeated cannibalism in a species that also cared for its sick and grieved its dead. The mystery is not what happened in that cave. The mystery is the one the bones press directly against. If our closest evolutionary relatives, with 99.7% of our DNA, were capable of this, then the impulse did not vanish when they did. It came forward with us. What we do with that knowledge, whether we look at it or look away, says something about us that the bones at Mulagursi said about them. The answer is inside us. It has always been inside us. Neanderthals ate their own and left the bones for us to find. Item 8 is more recent, more sudden, and on a far larger scale. A pit full of headless men in an English field. The Vikings came, and they left something behind they never meant us to find. Number 8, giant skeletons. In June 2009, construction workers cutting a new road through the chalk downland near Weymouth in Dorset, southern England, hit something unexpected several feet below the surface. The excavation stopped. Archaeologists moved in. What they found, at the bottom of a roughly dug pit, were the skeletal remains of 54 young men. All of them had been decapitated. The heads had been collected and stacked together at one end of the pit. The bodies had been thrown in separately, in a heap, without ceremony or arrangement. No grave goods, no individual burials, just bodies in a pit and heads in a pile, deposited together and covered over, left in the chalk for 1,000 years until a road crew found them. Isotope analysis of the teeth, which record the chemistry of the water a person drank during childhood, placed their origins in Scandinavia. These were Vikings. They had come to England, as Vikings did in that era, seeking something: wealth, land, opportunity, conquest. They had found something else entirely. Someone had caught them, stripped them, killed them, and then taken their heads off. And the people who did it were the ones history remembers as the victims. The killings occurred around 970 to 1025 AD, a period of sustained and brutal conflict between Anglo-Saxon England and the Danish Viking forces that had been raiding, settling, and at various points ruling significant portions of the country for nearly 2 centuries. The 54 men ranged in age from their late teens to their mid-30s, fighters, all of them at the prime age for raiding. Their bones carry the record of the violence. Blade marks on the vertebrae of the neck, consistent with multiple sword strikes, some of them poorly aimed before the fatal cut landed. Several skeletons show additional wounds to the hands and forearms, defensive injuries, the marks left when a person raises their arms against the blade. Some of them fought. Some of them saw it coming. The decapitation occurred at or very shortly after the moment of death, and the clean separation of heads from bodies into distinct piles suggests the process was organized. This was not the chaos of a battlefield, but the cold efficiency of an execution. Someone was in charge. Someone gave instructions. The heads were kept, probably displayed, certainly not buried with the respect the English would have given their own dead. The local population had motive accumulated across generations. Viking raids on the English coast have been documented since 793 AD, when the monastery at Lindisfarne was attacked and its monks killed or enslaved. For 2 centuries, coastal and riverside communities across England had lived with the periodic reality of longships appearing without warning, of buildings burned and livestock taken and people carried away. By the early 11th century, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard had conquered England outright, and his son Knut would rule it for nearly 2 decades. The English were not passive victims. They raided back, formed armies, negotiated, betrayed, and massacred when the opportunity arose. On November 13th, 1002, King Athelred II ordered the killing of all Danes living in England, an event known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. The pit at Weymouth fits into a landscape of violence that ran in every direction simultaneously, where the categories of aggressor and defender changed, depending on which year you were looking at and which side of the sea you were standing on. The 54 men in that pit were almost certainly raiders. The people who killed them had almost certainly lost someone to raiding. The Headless Vikings are not a story about monsters and innocence. They are a story about what happens when fear and rage accumulate long enough to find an outlet. The English ancestors who executed those men are not remembered for it. The Vikings are remembered, celebrated, even in television series and popular mythology, as noble warriors of the North, fierce but honorable, their violence aestheticized, and their complexity flattened into a brand. The Anglo-Saxons who killed 54 men and stacked their heads in a pit do not feature in that mythology at all. History in the popular imagination runs on heroes and villains, and the pit at Weymouth refuses both categories. The men in the pit raided. The men who put them there had been raided. Everyone in this story was someone else's monster. The romanticism that surrounds the Viking age, the long ships, the horned helmets that they did not actually wear, the sagas, the warrior codes, exists in part because we never see the pit. We see the ships sailing out. We do not see what they left behind, and we do not see what was done to them when someone finally had enough. The Weymouth assemblage, as archaeologists formally call it, is now held and studied at the Dorset County Museum. Isotopic and DNA analysis has continued to refine the picture of who these men were, where they came from, and what the last hours of their lives looked like. They were healthy, well-nourished, physically capable men from various parts of Scandinavia, traveling together, caught somewhere on or near the Dorset coast. Their names are completely unknown. Not one of them left a trace in any written record. They exist only in their bones and in the questions those bones generate. What will future archaeologists make of our mass graves, our unmarked pits, our executed and discarded dead? Every century produces them. The methods change. The pit does not. The Vikings of Dorset died quickly, in the open air by the blade. Item 9 is a different kind of death, slower, more private, and in some ways more terrifying. A death that happened in the dark, underground, that left its evidence not in cut marks, but in the position of the body and the expression on the face. The screaming dead, sealed in the earth, waiting to be found. Number 9, the screaming mum. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there's a mummy that has been troubling researchers since it was unwrapped in 1886. It is known as Unknown Man E. He is a young man, likely in his 20s, and his face is frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Mouth open wide, head thrown back, every muscle of the jaw and neck contracted as though caught mid-scream. He was not wrapped in the careful, ceremonial manner of Egyptian royalty. He was bundled hastily in plain sheepskin, a material considered ritually unclean. His hands and feet were bound. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings, among pharaohs and nobles, in a tomb he had no business being in. For over a century, Egyptologists debated what he was: a criminal, a disgraced prince, a foreign dignitary. Modern toxicological analysis found traces of a powerful plant-based sedative in his tissue. Unknown man, he may not have been dead when the wrapping began. And he was not the only one. In museums across the world, in collections from Egypt to Peru to medieval Europe, there are mummies with open mouths, contracted limbs, and facial expressions that decomposition alone cannot fully explain. Science is now catching up to what those expressions have been trying to tell us. The screaming mummies are not confined to a single culture or a single period. They appear in the royal caches of ancient Egypt, in the elaborate burial complexes of the Inca, in the churchyard catacombs of 18th century Europe. What they share is a specific cluster of physical characteristics. Mouth open, head tilted back or to the side, hands sometimes raised or positioned near the face, the general posture of a body in distress rather than rest. For decades, the standard explanation held that these features were the natural result of post-mortem muscle relaxation. The jaw drops as the body stiffens and then releases. The posture shifts as soft tissue decomposes and contracts. That explanation is not wrong. It accounts for many open-mouthed mummies. But CT scanning technology applied to several specific cases has found evidence that complicates it. Collapsed lung tissue, fractured ribs with fracture patterns inconsistent with post-mortem settling, hemorrhaging in soft tissue areas that only occurs during active physiological distress. In a small but significant number of cases, the body in the wrapping or the coffin was alive, at least briefly, after burial began. The scream is not a trick of decomposition. It is a record of the last thing that person experienced. The cause is split into two categories, and both are terrible. The first is medical error. Cholera, as noted in earlier accounts of Guanajuato, was the most common culprit. Its late stages so closely mimic the stillness of death that families and physicians with no modern diagnostic tools made the understandable, catastrophic mistake. Epilepsy produced similar confusion, as did certain poisonings, severe hypothermia, and what we would now recognize as catatonic states. The person was declared dead. The burial preparations began. In Egypt, that meant embalming, a process that would itself cause death if the subject were still living. In Europe, it meant the coffin lid and then the earth on top of it. The fear of premature burial became so prevalent in 19th century Europe that it generated an entire industry of safety coffins. Designs patented in England, Germany, and the United States featuring bells, air tubes, and flag mechanisms that a revived occupant could trigger from inside. The fact that this industry existed and found a market tells you something about how common the fear was and how frequently the fear was grounded in documented reality. The second category is more deliberate and harder to excuse. In the burial complexes of the Chimu and Inca civilizations in ancient Peru, high-status individuals were interred with attendants, servants, wives, bodyguards, whose role was to continue serving in the afterlife. The attendants did not always die before burial. Archaeological analysis of several Peruvian sites has found skeletal evidence of individuals buried in postures consistent with struggle, with rope marks on the wrists, with the specific bone damage that occurs when a living person is confined and suffocates. They were placed in the tomb alive, sealed in, and left. The priests and rulers who ordered this believed they were providing for their dead, equipping them for existence in whatever came next. The attendants who clawed at the walls in the dark were a necessary cost of that provision. The screaming was not a problem to be solved. It was the price of the ritual. The screaming mummies are displayed in museums as objects of fascination and, at a slight remove, aesthetic interest. The Cairo Museum labels Unknown Man with clinical language about uncertain identity and unusual burial circumstances. The Peruvian burial attendants are described in terms of ritual practice and cultural context. The framing is archaeological. The word victim does not typically appear. This is not dishonesty exactly. It is the ordinary operation of museological distance, the translation of human suffering into historical artifact that makes it possible to display the dead without confronting what their display actually means. The mummies are presented as windows into the past. What they are, in a significant number of cases, is evidence of people who died in absolute terror in a confined space, whose last experience was darkness and the inability to breathe, and who have been stared at by strangers ever since. Today, researchers with access to modern scanning equipment continue to work through museum collections, applying CT analysis to mummies that have not been examined with contemporary tools. Each new scan has the potential to revise the story of a specific individual, to shift them from the category of natural death into something else. How many of the world's mummies fall into that other category remains genuinely unknown. The number is almost certainly larger than the confirmed cases. The mummies cannot tell us. They can only hold the position their body locked into at the moment everything stopped, mouths open, the last sound they ever made frozen in the shape of their face. The question they leave is not historical. It is personal. In an era before reliable death certification, before the diagnostic tools that distinguish coma from death, before any of the medical infrastructure we take for granted, how many people went into the ground still breathing? The mummies do not answer. They just keep screaming silently behind the glass. The screaming mummies show us the terror at the end of life. Item 10 shows us something that has been present from the very beginning, a shadow inside the human genome, a ghost in the blood, the trace of another kind of human that still lives on inside every person alive today. Number 10. Forbidden Ritual. In 2010, a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology received a small fragment of bone from a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. It was a finger bone, the distal phalanx of a pinky finger belonging to a child, probably a girl, who had died approximately 50,000 years ago. The bone was so small it fit easily in the palm of a hand. The cave it came from, Denisova Cave, had already yielded Neanderthal remains, so the researchers expected another Neanderthal. They sequenced the mitochondrial DNA. What came back stopped them completely. The genetic signature matched neither Neanderthal nor modern human. It was something else, a population so distinct from both known lineages that it represented an entirely separate branch of the human family tree, one that had diverged from the Neanderthal line approximately 400,000 years ago and had been living, apparently, across a vast stretch of Asia ever since, invisible to science because no one had known to look for them. They named the species after the cave. They called her Denisovan, and then they looked more carefully at her DNA and found something that nobody had anticipated. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was a hybrid, the direct offspring of two different human species, living proof that these populations had not merely coexisted, but had found each other across whatever distances separated them and had children together. She was one child in one cave, preserved by Siberian cold for 50 millennia. And her existence rewrote everything we thought we knew about what it means to be human. Since that initial discovery, the physical evidence for the Denisovans has remained almost absurdly sparse. A handful of teeth, unusually large by modern human standards. A fragment of jawbone found in Tibet in the 1980s that sat in a monastery for decades before anyone thought to test its DNA. A small skull fragment. That is the complete fossil record of a human species that ranged from Siberia to Southeast Asia, that survived for hundreds of thousands of years, that encountered and interbred with at least two other human lineages. In terms of bones and artifacts, they are nearly invisible. But genetics has given us a portrait that physical remains could not. Ancient DNA extracted from modern human populations shows Denisovan inheritance scattered across a vast geographic range. Up to 6% of the genome in populations from Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australia. Lower but detectable percentages across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, trace amount in populations as far west as South Asia. The interbreeding happened multiple times in multiple places across thousands of years of contact. This was not a single encounter. It was a long, recurring entanglement between human populations that modern taxonomy classifies as separate species, but whose bodies, apparently, did not observe that distinction. The genes the Denisovans left behind are not inert passengers. They are functional, and in several cases they appear to have been actively selected for, meaning populations that carried them survived and reproduced more successfully than those that did not. Tibetan populations carry a Denisovan variant of a gene called EPS1 that regulates the body's response to low-oxygen environments, allowing them to live and work at altitudes that cause debilitating altitude sickness in people without the variant. The Denisovans who contributed that gene had apparently been living at high altitude long enough to evolve a physiological adaptation to it, and when they interbred with the ancestors of modern Tibetans, that adaptation passed forward and became one of the most significant survival advantages in human history at altitude. The immune system genes are similarly functional. Denisovan-derived variants appear in the HLA system, the part of the human immune system responsible for identifying foreign pathogens, and they likely expanded the range of threats that recipient populations could recognize and respond to. The Denisovans did not simply disappear into the past. They made us better at surviving. They are, in a very literal sense, still contributing. The discovery of the Denisovans is only 15 years old, which means it has not yet fully penetrated the popular understanding of human prehistory. Most people who learned human evolution before 2010 were taught a relatively clean story. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, spread across the world, encountered Neanderthals and other archaic humans, and replaced them, whether through competition, violence, or simple demographic dominance. Modern humans were the endpoint, the survivors, the victors. The Denisovan evidence dismantles that narrative at the foundation. We did not replace the other humans. We absorbed them. We interbred with Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe. We interbred with Denisovans in Asia and possibly elsewhere. There is emerging evidence of additional archaic human populations in Africa whose genetic signatures appear in modern African genomes and who have not yet been identified from any fossil record at all. Ghost lineages, known only from the DNA they left behind in living people. The human species is not a clean line descending from a single origin. It is a braid woven from multiple strands that kept meeting and merging across hundreds of thousands of years, and we're the current, temporary form of that ongoing process. The Denisovans challenge something deeper than our understanding of prehistory. They challenge the self-image that sits underneath it, the idea that Homo sapiens is a distinct, coherent, singular kind of being, different in kind from everything that came before. That idea is ancient and persistent, and, it turns out, genetically incorrect. We are not pure. Every person reading this, depending on their ancestry, carries somewhere between 0 and 6% of their genome from a species that we only discovered existed 15 years ago. The Denisovan girl in Denisova Cave, with her Neanderthal mother and her Denisovan father, was not an aberration. She was an example of what the human story actually looked like: messy, overlapping, boundary-crossing, genetically entangled. The clean species boundaries exist in our taxonomy. They did not exist on the ground, in the caves and river valleys where different kinds of humans kept finding each other in the dark and doing what humans do. What the Denisovans looked like, we do not know. Computational models built from their DNA suggest a broad face, a wide dental arch, a robust build, but these are inferences from genetics, not portraits. What they believed, whether they buried their dead or decorated their bodies or told stories around fires, we cannot say. Almost nothing they made has been definitively identified. They lived for 400,000 years and left almost no trace except the fragment of a child's finger and the genes they passed to the people who came after them. They are the most intimate strangers in human history, closer to us than any other species that has ever lived, carriers of adaptations that keep some of us alive today, and almost entirely unknown. They're the ghosts in the genome. They're the other humans, and they're still inside us, as present as they were 50,000 years ago in a cave in Siberia, waiting for the science to catch up and tell us what they were. The 10 discoveries in this video share one truth. The bog bodies, the skulls under the floors, the carved Venus, the screaming dead of Guanajuato, the burned children of Carthage, the drowned footprints, the cannibal cousins, the headless men in the English chalk, the mummies frozen mid-scream, and the ghost species living in our own DNA, all of them say the same thing. The past is not a simpler version of the present. It is a stranger place, populated by people as intelligent and as human as we are, who did things we find incomprehensible, who wanted things we do not recognize, who vanished and left behind only the evidence of their existence. We are not the conclusion of the human story. We are the latest chapter, and the chapters before us were darker, stranger, and more complicated than we have been willing to admit. The past is not finished with us. It never was. We started with a man in a Danish bog, strangled, placed face up in the dark water, preserved for 2,400 years until a shovel found him. We end with a girl in a Siberian cave, 50,000 years old, the daughter of two different human species, her DNA threading forward through the centuries until it lives, quietly, inside people walking the earth today. Between those 2 points, we have covered 12,000 years of human behavior, and the picture that emerges does not resemble the one we are usually shown. We have seen skulls plastered and kept on shelves like family heirlooms. We have seen a figurine carved with no face and enormous hips, beautiful to people who lived through famines we cannot imagine. We have seen a museum where the dead hang on the walls with their mouths open. We have seen 20,000 urns containing the burned bones of children, stacked in layers 6 centuries deep. We have seen footprints from a world the ocean swallowed. We have seen our closest evolutionary relatives process each other like deer carcasses. We have seen 54 headless men thrown into an English pit, and mummies whose last breath left its mark in fractured ribs. The pattern across all of it is undeniable. The past is not a gentle climb toward the civilization we inhabit now. It is a horror story, and we are not the audience. We are the heirs. The tragedy is not that our ancestors were brutal. Every era has its brutality, and ours is no exception. The tragedy is the forgetting. We have constructed a story about ourselves in which the violence belongs to the past, in which progress is the direction of travel, in which we are the civilized endpoint of a long and difficult journey. The bones do not support that story. The Neanderthal genes in our genome do not support it. The impulse that built the Tophet of Carthage, and the impulse that built the Guanajuato Mummy Museum, and the impulse that stacked 54 Viking heads in a pit are not relics of a species we have left behind. They are features of the species we are. The only distance between us and every horror in this video is circumstance, different pressures, different beliefs, different systems of meaning that made the unthinkable not only thinkable, but holy. The bones are not warning us about our ancestors. They're warning us about ourselves. The forgetting is still happening. Textbooks still sanitize. Museums still label. Popular history still reaches for the version of the past that makes us comfortable. But the footprints are still in the mud at Çatalhöyük. The hot bone fractures are still in the urns at Carthage. The Denisovan DNA is still in your cells, doing its quiet work, keeping some of you alive at altitude, helping some of you fight diseases your purely Homo sapiens immune system might not recognize. The past does not stay where we put it. It comes forward with us, whether we acknowledge it or not. You now know what the bones actually say. You now know what the DNA reveals. That knowledge is uncomfortable, and it is supposed to be. Share this video. Say what you know. The silence around these discoveries is not accidental. It takes effort to maintain it, and that effort belongs to all of us every time we choose the comfortable story over the true one. Which of these 10 discoveries terrifies you most? Not which is the most dramatic. Which one sits with you? Which one changes the way you see yourself or your species or the world you live in? Comment below. The most haunting answer gets pinned. Next time, we go inside the archives, the ancient texts that were gathered, cataloged, and burned by the Vatican, and the secrets those texts contained that someone decided the world should never read. subscribe so you are there when it goes up. And remember, as someone once said about a different kind of history, the past is not dead. It is not even past.